want to say welcome to all those who are with us, all the Ignatian educators from both secondary and higher education across the Ignatian network, especially, of course, a large contingent of people representing Jesuit institutions throughout the United States. So we're so grateful to have you here. We hope that our time together can be fruitful and meaningful for you in the context of the work you're doing at your institution amid this very unique and challenging time. My name's Chris Kerr. I'm the Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And for those of you who don't know as much about ISN, ISN is a national social justice education and advocacy organization rooted in the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We work especially with Jesuit institutions across the United States, the 27 universities, over 60 secondary schools, as well as parishes and other ministries. And we work with many other institutions that are inspired and motivated, called by, through the Ignatian spiritual tradition, as well as through the Jesuit pedagogical tradition. And so, so much of our work happens through partners at secondary institutions and universities, and around a range of issues, including migration, care for creation, economic justice, racial justice. So we're excited to have you with us today. If you're not as familiar with the Ignatian Solidarity Network, I hope you will go to our website, ignatiansolidarity.net, and learn a little bit more about the work that we do. And I was going to make just a quick plug for two upcoming things that we have before we get started as well. One is our weekly Solidarity on Tap events that we host. Solidarity on Tap is typically an in-person event that happens at bars or pubs across the country for especially folks kind of post-college, post-undergrad, young alumni, current and former Jesuit volunteers, folks like that. But of course, we're not gathering in bars and pubs right now. So we've been doing it virtually at 9 p.m. Eastern time every Wednesday night. And so I encourage you to check that out. We'll be welcoming Sister Simone Campbell, who's the Executive Director of Network. You might have heard of the nuns on the bus. Sister Simone was the lead nun on that one. And the following week, we'll be joined by Sister Helen Prejean, the well-known activist and author focused on working to end the death penalty. The other program I want to share is next Monday, we'll host a conversation on the situation of migrants in the Americas in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. We'll have partners from the Jesuit works in Central America, Mexico, at the US-Mexico border, as well as in Canada, offering perspectives on the situation of migrants. So you can find that on our YouTube page, or if you visit our website at ignatiansolidarity.net. Also, one other note before I begin, we are recording this session. We're doing that so that we can share it with other Ignatian educators who weren't able to join, or who weren't, we had a cap we had to put on this because of the technology. So we have many folks that wrote us after we filled up and wanted to be with us, and we had to say no. So we're recording it with the intention of sharing it with other colleagues, just so you know, okay? As I mentioned, we're excited to have so many people here, so many different institutions represented, and we thought this would be a unique opportunity to gather people virtually, Ignatian educators, to reflect and discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Ignatian tradition, and to share resources of support to create a culture of care during these challenging times. It's no secret that amidst this crisis, communities of color have been disproportionately impacted in a variety of ways that I'm sure we'll get a chance for Mary to touch on today. So we're excited to have Dr. Mary Wardell Ghirarduzzi, who's the Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer at University of San Francisco, joining us today. Now, Mary's an educator and thought leader on implementing a broad-based diversity and inclusion strategy. She understands the unique duty of leaders to advance social justice in their organization. She served as an inaugural Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer of the University of San Francisco since 2011 and is a leadership and organizational change professor in USF School of Education and School of Management. She is the president of the San Francisco Public Library Commission, stewarding a $160 million budget for one of the most important public anchor institutions in North America. Mary received the Most Influential Woman Award by the San Francisco Business Times in 2017 for the impact of her leadership in the community as a university and civic leader. Mary's also a member of the board of directors of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, so I'm honored to be able to work with her in that capacity, and just grateful for her time and colleagueship and things like that. So Mary, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. I'm going to turn it over to you, and you just tell me when you want me to put up the slides, and just be bold and deliberate in telling me when you want to go to the next slide, things like that. No shame. All right. So we'll turn it over to you. Okay.
Okay. Well, it is such a pleasure to be here with you. I went and ate lunch in between, and I think I have lipstick right here. I had a webinar earlier. I met with CEOs of libraries across the country, and I had about 30 minutes in between, and I grabbed a little something to eat. So it's really exciting just to be here with my colleagues, primarily through the Jesuit network, but I know that there's other campuses that are part of the Ignatian family that we get to see each other normally each fall when we come together in the teach-in, and we're working on right now on what that might look like for us in these months ahead. We're working on it right now. But one of the reasons I am here is that I believe that we have both a unique calling in our tradition, our Ignatian tradition. And I think the times that we're in right now are really inviting us to think critically about the ways in which we have disproportionately and but yet systemically left communities and populations behind. As you may know, and you've just heard, I lead in the space of equity and inclusion, particularly at the University of San Francisco, and I'm using that platform as broadly and as widely as I can just to help to alarm and to help to build consciousness about what is both the promise of equity and inclusion, and if we're going to have a promise that also suggests that there's places and spaces where we have not fulfilled it. And so much of the work that I do is just to use the power of our network, but even more so the brilliance of our mission, particularly the Jesuit mission, as both a response to and as a way to ameliorate and to mitigate much of the inequity that has happened and continues to happen in the forms of institutional racism. And so today we're going to be talking a bit more about institutional racism specifically. We're going to be looking at it through the lens of a group of community members, of a population of family, friends, and beloved ones that we know and that we work with and whom we teach, who are being impacted every single day. And I think it's really important that we pay attention to those that are who are always disproportionately impacted. And I'd like to spend our next hour and so together really talking about the impacts to the API community. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind, I put together a slide deck. And so we're going to go through each one of these slides and Chris will get the opening one there for us. And then at the end, in our Ignatian pedagogical tradition, I've created some reflection for us to consider as we move forward. And then if I do this right, we'll have some time to have some questions, and perhaps Kelly and other team members of the ISN network might be able to help us with responding to some questions. I think there's actually some questions that have already been submitted that we can also respond to. But This is a work product that I have been doing and that we have been doing here at USF, that I have given it to the university's leadership, the Dean's Council, as well as groups of faculty and students and staff, just to build our awareness to the issues of racism against the API community, specifically during COVID-19. Chris, if you wouldn't mind advancing. And I want to talk about why this is so important. I think we have to begin with just naming the reality that we're in and what I call building the case. In this case, the equity case. There is a mounting racism that we know that is happening against API communities. When I say, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm using Asian Pacific Islander, knowing that anyone that is perceived to be Asian or Asian American or Pacific Islander, or even you may not be any of those groups, but you might be perceived to belong to those, that those individuals are being targeted. And then I'm going to spend some time talking specifically about the targeting of Chinese Americans, who are actually the primary targets of all of this particular racism that we're seeing related to COVID-19. So the case is that there's mounting racism that is happening among populations and communities since the public became aware. Really, I would say it really began in February when we really started to see the tracking and what I call patterns of experiences that people were having regardless of where they were located. And my comments are going to be really within a US context. That we began to start seeing patterns of incidents happening on the streets. They were happening in grocery stores. They were happening as people were exiting elevators. They were happening in parking lots. They were happening while people were just literally walking down the street and people were driving by. And specifically, one of the things that I think that is important for Ignatian educators to consider is that this targeting of mounting racism that kind of came up and almost out of nowhere, at least it would seem that way. And I'm going to go further in our presentation. I'm going to show you that none of this is out of nowhere, but it may seem to some that it is further compounded by what we call kind of an existing stereotype threat, the myth of the model minority that Asians and Asian Americans often have within a US context. You compound it with that, there's a threat that emerges in that there is a lower reporting of incidents that were taking place, at least initially in the first few weeks and months, meaning that this has been, we know as a greatly underreported incidents of being targeted. And now that more education is happening, which is exactly what this webinar is intended to do, that underreporting will hopefully be ameliorated, and that individuals who are experiencing it will know that they have communities, that they have schools, that they have people, that they have allies that are paying attention, and that we have come together with providing resources to be responsive to it. One of the things that before we leave this slide and that I think it's really important to talk about is that this is happening in the context of leadership. This is happening within the context of a legitimization of the acts that are happening on the ground and in our communities. Specifically, there has been a multitude of news briefings. You could turn on the news, doesn't even matter what your political affiliation or identity is, you would hear this across all the news networks, both on television as well as on the radio, the use of the terms that were racist and referring to a group of people or social and cultural identity or geographic geographic region. And you see there are 3 of them that were regularly used by individuals who were elected and or appointed in leadership roles. And so what that did is that it created a spurring on, if you will, if you want to call it that, a sense that this was okay. And which we know that that is not the case by using terms such as Chinese virus and Kung flu and Wuhan virus. And that continues even on today. And so, Chris, if you can go to the next slide. So that's kind of the context in which some of this is happening. But if you go a little bit even further, you have to look at the context of the anti-Asian sentiment that has emerged, is also in the context of the Chinese American experience, specifically with the xenophobia that they experienced from mid to late the late century. I'm looking at the chat box, but the chat box, I guess it looks like an amen there. So I think that is a great. This xenophobia has been going on so early in our American experience, specifically with Asian Americans, and even more specifically was a targeting of Chinese Americans. Congress passed a series of anti-immigrant legislations that actually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so oftentimes we know, we teach students about the legislation of 1882, but oftentimes as adults and as educators, we ourselves are not even aware of the sentiment that led to that, which was really a sentiment of working class white Americans who were concerned and created a level of anxiety and fear of the role of the Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans that had come into the community and were concerned that they were taking their jobs and taking their economic prosperity opportunities away. So those things led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Basically, it was a response to the social sentiment of the time, which then, moved to the expanded to all persons of Asian and Arab descent through the Immigration Act of 1924. And then that continued on, even while Jim Crow and other things were going on in the backdrop. We saw the same, but an even horrific set of circumstances happen with the Japanese Americans who were interned and isolated and put in involuntary incarceration in World War II. So this current anti-Asian sentiment is not new, and I know that as Ignatian educators, we know that, but I think it's important that as we kind of build out our lesson plans and as we have our conversations, that we always put this racial justice work in an historical context. Chris, if you wouldn't mind advancing it. And if we're going to do this, and if we're going to do it honestly, we have to put it in the context of what I call anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, in which all of our racism in the US context is really situated. And so in this case, we begin in 1619, which is really helpful for us to understand as we are looking at the experiences that students and faculty and staff and our next door neighbors and our community is having right now as it relates to the COVID-19 situation. It's all within the context of anti-Blackness. It's all within the context of the acts that we did against Native Americans, the genocide and the slavery that African Americans experienced. And so this larger systemic as well as institutional racism is also then connected to everything else that we see. And we know that the ISN has done a lot of work, particularly around immigration justice. And so you look and see the acts that has of inhumanity that is currently happening through some of our projects at the border that many of us are involved in. And we see that the anti-immigrant sentiment is in the context of the anti-Asian sentiment, which is in the context of the anti-Black and the anti-Indigenous. We see the same with our brothers and sisters, our Muslim identified brothers and sisters, who have had a series of incidents over the last over 10, 12 years, really very seriously. And then we have seen serious anti-Semitic acts that continue to happen against synagogues throughout the country. And I believe that it's intersects because race always intersects with issues of gender identity. We see an anti-trans movement, as well as a movement against gender non-conforming persons. And then if you look at the disability as well as the environmental movements, disability issues are further impacted by the intersection of race. And so all of this work that we're looking at, even within the anti-racism that is presented with Asians right now in COVID-19, is within the backdrop and the context of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And I think that's very important for us to always to keep our finger on the pulse, not only as we attempt to do the work that we do, but much of our work is around telling the truth and to reconcile that. And you can't move toward a place of reconciliation if you're not able to talk about racism in an accurate and a truthful context, and to put it within the terms of institutionalized and systemic racisms and how they intersect and impact us today. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind advancing for me. And so one of the things that I know and that we know it's important to do is that it's always important to collect data. As a Chief Diversity Officer, I live and oftentimes breathe with both the narratives of community members, as well as making sure that we have good information and so that we might be able to do advocacy. And so one of the first things that I think is important to do is to understand what are the advocacy organizations available to us? What are the advocacy organizations near you? And make sure that you have good data and narratives around experiences. And so this slide is my example that I've shared with my community. The first one is a national organization. And I think it's really important. So everyone on this call needs to pay attention to this website, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They are the clearinghouse right now for collecting information and data on the incidents of racism, and it's coming from assaults, it's coming from bias incidents. It's really not anything such as a microaggression, because they're all macroaggressions, harassment, and all the multitude of ways in which Asian Americans are experiencing these incidents. They are the national clearinghouse. And this particular statistic was released just 2 days ago. Within the last 2 weeks of March, so these for March, that would be March 15th through the end of March of 2020. So just a matter of a few weeks ago, they've been able to tally it, and there were 1,100 reports were made. So if you intersect that with the threat of the model minority myth that society oftentimes puts upon our Asian American brothers and sisters. And then in many ways, we all act out in our own both conscious and unconscious ways of that real threat. You can imagine that 1,100 reports, it should be multiplied by many more, but that is only the number that has come forward. And those are usually very egregious reports that people have made. Also in the greater Los Angeles area, and I think that this is even though they're not a national organization, I find that they are a great advocacy organization. So as a diversity officer, when I want to do work in understanding what's happening in the API community, I look to the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Modeling Council that serves the greater LA community. But even though I'm in the Bay Area, San Francisco, I go through their website for resources and support. And then right in my own backyard is the Chinese for Affirmative Action, which is a long-standing civil rights organization. And they keep their finger on the pulse of the issues. And so this is a modeling that I've done for you to make sure that you understand what are the local, what are the state, what are the regional resources that you might be able to have access to for your own students, faculty, and staff. Make sure that you're connected, make sure that you know where they are, and put those together and make sure you make them available to those that are in your community. And last but not least, then in this presentation, which Chris will make available later for all the participants, is just a statement that the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans wrote to Congress urging them to denounce the anti-Asian racism. They wrote that in early March. This is the website that I was referring to. Now what they have changed it so that it's easy to access. It's the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. But if you go to standagainsthatred.org, that's where the reporting is happening, the national reporting, as well as the collecting of stories. Chris, if you wouldn't mind advancing, I want to share a couple of testimonies. This is a testimonial from the website, and this was this is how they referred to their incident. They received a package. It was signed for by C COVID. A FedEx driver put in signed for C COVID after handing the package to my mother, who is Chinese American. The package was addressed to my sister, whose first initial is C. And the reporter of this incident goes on to say, I don't understand how they think it's okay to refer to customers as the coronavirus. One of the things that I saw within the community members that I had an opportunity to connect with, and as well as in my own research and reading narratives, is that this situation has created not only hurt and harm, but in some ways it actually has created some confusion, because individuals are saying, but why are you targeting me? Because of the startled nature of the acts of racism that has been happening. And Chris, if you would advance it, there's another testimony that I have here. This is another one from the website. I was walking back from getting groceries when I saw an older gentleman approaching, so I started walking closer along a building wall to practice social distancing. I became a bit more on guard as I noticed he kept staring at me and wasn't moving further away. As he approached me, he snarled, "Your people disgust me," and spat on the ground at me. There has been multiple incidents of Asian Americans or Asian identified people who actually have been spit on in San Francisco and all throughout the country. One of the incidents, a horrific one that many of you I'm sure is aware of, was on March 14th with a stabbing of a Hmong family, a Hmong American family in Texas. And on April 5th was an acid attack on a Chinese American woman in Brooklyn. And so as this language continues from our national leaders, and the use of racist rhetoric continues, we will continue to see a rise in this. And one of the things I think is going to be important for us as Ignatian educators is that as we are kind of, waiting to see what our state officials and local officials will say, and what we're going to do over the summer and what we're going to be doing over the fall, to see how will we continue doing our education. this particular coronavirus is expected to have ongoing impacts in our community, meaning that it is expected to reoccur in certain areas dependent on our ability or inability to practice safe social distancing and all the measures that we have been directed to take. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about as a diversity officer is that what we see today and what all of the chief diversity officers who are paying close attention to this in the country, we're seeing an ongoing growing pattern that we do not see ending in any time soon. And that the current coronavirus, based upon what we expect to see, is that we're going to see those type of corresponding racist behaviors maintain themselves while we are still working through, and as we're going back to school and going back to class and reopening the economy, these things are going to be happening as well. And so part of our job and part of our responsibility as Ignatian educators is to be cognizant of this. Part of our job is to keep our fingers on the pulse of this. Part of our job is to know the testimonies where you are located. You need to know what is happening with the students on your campus. We need to know what's happening within the staff and the faculty on our campus. We need to be checking on our API community members that live on our block, that are on our campus, because these issues are going to continue and they're going to persist. And so, Chris, if you can go on to the next slide. So one of the things I think that our network has is that the Ignatian tradition has what I call a sense of hope. And as Chris and all of us that have been engaged in this work, we call it a radical hope. That's what we did this past November when we came together and that incredible gathering at the Teach-In, where all these public witnesses around our radical hope. And so if that's the case, what is the radical hope that we need to be thinking about right now in response to the racism that we're seeing in COVID-19, and not only today, but that we will see in the future? And I think that, I know that many of you have seen it, but for the purposes of grounding us in this work, because I've now built the case and I've contextualized it, and part of my job as an equity and a diversity leader is to bubble up the issues so that we are made aware of them. So now I think I want to move us to this place of, so what might we do with the situation? And I like for us just to be grounded in Father Sosa's message.
¿Y si Dios te hablara? ¿Qué te diría Él? ¿Puedes oír esto? ¿Puedes oír su llamado?
Durante los últimos 16 meses, la Compañía de Jesús ha estado discerniendo cómo responder mejor a las exigencias actuales de la misión que le ha sido encomendada. Somos un grupo grande, esparcido por todo el mundo, formado por jesuitas y muchas otras personas con las que colaboramos en la misión de la Iglesia Católica. Somos seguidores de Jesús, el Señor crucificado y resucitado. El proceso ha culminado con la aprobación y confirmación del Papa Francisco. Por eso hoy anunciamos las 4 preferencias apostólicas universales para guiar el esfuerzo apostólico de la Compañía de Jesús en los próximos 10 años. Los ejercicios espirituales de San Ignacio y la práctica del discernimiento personal y en común son nuestro modo preferencial de mostrar a los seres humanos el camino hacia Dios. La condición es que nosotros, los jesuitas, seamos hombres de oración y profundamente arraigados en Cristo para poder compartir con quienes colaboramos en la misión y todas las personas de buena voluntad este tesoro espiritual, porque somos un grupo que discierne, nos comprometemos también a difundir el discernimiento como modo de tomar decisiones en sintonía con los deseos de Dios para la humanidad en todos los campos en los que nos movemos en nuestra vida y trabajo. Preferimos caminar junto a los pobres, los descartados del mundo, los vulnerados en su dignidad. El camino que queremos hacer junto a los pobres es el de promover la justicia social y el cambio de las estructuras económicas, políticas y sociales generadoras de injusticia. Esta es una dimensión necesaria de la reconciliación de los seres humanos, los pueblos y sus culturas entre sí, con la naturaleza y con Dios. Son los jóvenes, con su perspectiva, quienes pueden ayudarnos a comprender mejor el cambio de época que estamos viviendo y su novedad esperanzadora. Queremos caminar con ellos, discernir estas posibilidades y encontrar a Dios en las profundidades de la realidad. La creación hoy clama como nunca antes, ansiando ser liberada. La actual crisis ambiental está afectando de manera particular a los pobres y vulnerables. Como seguidores de Jesús, junto a todas las personas de buena voluntad, queremos actuar urgentemente para detener el deterioro de nuestra casa común y dejarla en las mejores condiciones posibles a las futuras generaciones. Todavía podemos cambiar el curso de la historia. Aceptamos la invitación a formar parte de ese cambio, poniendo en práctica en nuestra vida y misión estas 4 preferencias.
Le animamos a que aprenda más y lleve a cabo estas acciones con nosotros, para que todos respondamos al llamado de Dios, expresado a través del clamor de este mundo.
So that is the universal apostolic preferences. They are tenets that are guiding the Jesuit works over the next 10 years. So the University of San Francisco is a Jesuit work. Jesuit high schools are Jesuit works. The parishes are Jesuit works. The ways in which we are being guided to think about how to leverage and to use our mission of solidarity is an invitation that all of us are discerning in our work, and what does that mean? And so one of the things that I have done and that I am doing is that my work now is to help animate this idea of the universal apostolic preferences, but through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to do so in the Ignatian tradition. And so you can see the 4 preferences there that Father Sosa just discussed. Show the way to God through the spiritual exercises of discernment. Walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice. Accompany young people in the creation of a hope-filled future, and to collaborate with gospel depth for the protection and the renewal of God's creation. And you'll notice that I have bolded one of them, which is often referred to as the second one. Walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated in a mission of reconciliation and justice. The hope that we have in our Ignatian tradition in responding to COVID-19 racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenousness, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism, and all the things that we are dealing with right now, is to embody this direction that we have, and to think about equity and inclusion work is essentially our way of trying to reconcile what we have done or what we are doing in our institutions so that we might center those that have been the vulnerable. We will ask ourselves question, well, who's vulnerable in this situation? Who has been systemically or historically marginalized? Who has disproportionate educational outcomes, whether it be retention or graduation? Who needs our attention the most? And so I believe that the work that we are all being called to do, at least the work that I know that I'm being called to do, is to respond to what I know is the demand of equity. And equity demands us to center and to respond to the needs of those who require the most and who require that now. And I think that that's what this universal apostolic preference is really saying. It really is the preference that Father Sosa and the Jesuit community has put forward. It's the call for equity. And this is the way that all of us are going to be able to respond to the issues that are happening right now with the API community, but it's actually extended to the other communities that I refer to, as all of this is an opportunity for us to look at issues of racism from an intersectional lens. And as Chris and as others have said through the Ignatian Solidarity Network, particularly I'm thinking of an incredible keynote address over the last 2 years, but one definitely 2 years ago that Father Massengill gave, where he, during one of the teach-ins, he taught us how racism is the bridge, if you want to call it, to all the other isms. And so he gave us a powerful way to think about how racism is connected to all of the marginalization and the vulnerabilities that we see that our mission seeks to address in our educational projects. And so this work is our work, responding to the API community now is the work of not only the Ignatian Solidarity Network, it's the work of anybody who calls him, her, or their self an Ignatian educator. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind advancing it. So my last 2 slides, where I'm moving now into, so what do we do from here? With understanding the situation, understanding the context, and being offered a way to respond, a hopeful way through our educational tradition to respond to these incidents of current day racism. One of the things is to do exactly what I have attempted to do in this webinar, is to recreate this yourself where you're located, and to pull together your own campus response. And if you've already done that, that's great, but to make sure that you have very clear your network of reporting structures. So this is just from my campus, but you'll know what that looks like for your campus. My office is the Diversity Engagement and Community Outreach. That's the Institutional Equity Office. If you don't happen to have an Institutional Equity or Diversity Office, wherever that work is located and whomever is doing it is where that work should be pulled together with and by others. Often it's student affairs. It's a multitude of centers, all kinds of cultural centers on our campuses. ISSSS is the international students area. Disability students services areas, wherever it is located on your campus, get the folks together. University ministry is key because of our Ignatian tradition. University ministry and our mission councils are critical in helping us ensure that our narrative is mission aligned, and to ensure that all of our equity and diversity work is aligned with our mission, that it's not an added to, that it actually is our mission in action. And then to always ensure that this work is embedded with the communities that are impacted the most. So in this particular example and case of this webinar, it's about racism against the API community during COVID-19. This case, the Asian and the Asian American Staff and Faculty Council at the university, all of the Asian and Asian American student organizations, make sure that they're at the center of these gatherings, as well as responses. And ensuring that you have an institutional response, a bias response team, a way in which you can respond to the incidents that are happening on your campus. I gave you examples of what's happened, how to respond to incidents that are happening. Perhaps, I don't know, you go to a Trader Joe's and something happens and someone tells you that something happens, and you can say, do you know about this national organization that you can report incidents to? But it's really important to be able to have these incidents reportable on our campuses. And so to ensure that those resources are available, that emails are sent out campus-wide, particularly during this virtual learning environment, that they see things coming out from campus leaders, so that those that are impacted and those that are not directly impacted, everyone understands how important it is to the campus community, that the campus is putting together some resources to respond. Chris, if you go to the next slide. One of the things that's always important, and I think this is a way that our schools, I think, where we shine in many ways, is that we know how to build community and how to build spaces of healing. And so one of the things that you'll see on this slide is a community building, a community healing space that was designed for the API community, And so to do whatever we can as allies and as leaders to ensure those spaces are happening. If there's a portion of the meeting in which they want to have everyone engaged, or if there's a portion of the meeting where they want to have university leaders and faculty who are not API identified in the meeting, that's great. And also recognize the importance of communities to be able to have space with people that identify and actually have direct experience based upon their identities. Identity-specific spaces have always been important. And that's one of the ways in which we build inclusion on campus. And you know, sometimes people say, well, you know, to have all these various groups, is it working against inclusion? Actually, no. I think that's the way in which people that have been historically or even currently marginalized and made vulnerable need to have spaces so that they might come together and be able to talk about their experiences without feeling that they have to perform or respond to or meet the needs of others who oftentimes can dominate the spaces for people who are marginalized. And so I think it's really important to create spaces where we can listen to the needs and concerns, where our, in this case, API members can come together as they see necessary, and then be able to respond back and perhaps report out and to us about what are some of the things that they may need from the campus community. I think with that, we're going to go into our last slide, which is a, I think I put some questions up Chris, I think there's one more slide. There it is. Okay. So I would offer us to just think about these things. As you take this back to your own campuses, you think about how this informs your work, how this informs your lessons, how it informs your curriculum, how it informs your leadership, just to respond to these from a very personal lens, you know. So what is my Ignatian witness amid the racism that's currently happening to COVID-19? You can respond to that in a way that I can't respond to. I gave you my response to it. You know, as a woman that is deeply committed to the Jesuit mission, as a collaborator and as a partner in this work, and as a woman who is African American and then has a a history of understanding the intersection of racism, as well as the ways in which it intersects with gender and sexism. You know, I bring a unique lens to this work that I try to then use it to offer as a way to help build consciousness within my own campus community and within the communities that I have access to, whether it be an invitation through ISN or wherever I have an invitation to for others to do the same. So what is our Ignatian witness amidst this current racism? The second question is, how can we create spaces of education? How do we create spaces of community? And how do we create spaces, in this case for API friends and loved ones on our campus and in our greater community? It could be through your parishes, it could be through your churches, it could be through whatever gatherings. And I know that everything is gathering virtually, but regardless of the manner in which we're gathering, the harm has not gone away. And so in absence of the traditional face-to-face gathering, I think that we actually are called to do more in the remote sense and our remote learning, to whether it be check-ins or whatnot, not to put individuals on the spot, but to invite people and to alert people that we care, that we know, that we're educating ourselves, even if it's to go back and say, I went to a webinar that dealt with these issues, and share it with your department, share it with others, because just doing that alone signals to others who might actually be Asian identified that you're paying attention to these issues. And if you do that with one group, then others are also noticing, other communities of color and other people are noticing when we show care for communities that are being marginalized. And then my last question is, what does our radical inclusiveness look like for us today? And so those are just some reflection questions for us. And I am going to leave that as like perhaps the last box that we leave open, but to ask Chris and my ISN colleagues to kind of lead us from there on how we might move forward.
Thanks, Mary. This was wonderful. Thanks so much for taking the time to put this kind of program together. And I really appreciate the focus on the needs of the API community. And that I think it's important to think about, you know, the ways that particular groups of people are being impacted by a reality like this. And I think it's in the mix of so much that is happening and changing in our country day to day. It can be easy to lose sight, right, of what are the needs of different groups. So thank you so much for highlighting that. We have a bunch of questions we can start with, and then if there are questions that folks want to share via the chat as well, we can do that. But I wanted to jump into just a few of the ones that people shared, you know, prior to us gathering here today, and some of them kind of go a little bit broader. Someone asked, and you referenced this in one of your reflection questions: how do we engage work of diversity, equity, inclusion with students and with colleagues and with other members of our campus community in this virtual reality, in this reality of you know, online instruction for students? You know, there's a lot of the contact now that's happening between educational institutions and students is very much focused on the instruction, right? It's not as much necessarily focused on the co-curricular experience or things like that. So how do we do that? How do we keep this at the center of the conversation? As I think, you know, you kind of invited us into kind of this holistic approach in this context.
You know, I think we do it by making it feel like it's part of the curriculum. We making it feel like it's part of the meeting. And so what I did was that the first time that I put this, so the very first thing I did was that I have a platform where I have a newsletter. And in the newsletter, we call it the diversity dashboard, where I pull together whatever the thoughts are, the programs, highlights, And I've increased that because of the virtual learning, and because I didn't have the benefit of just bumping into people on the quad or people dropping in my office. One of the things is like, okay, we have to increase our communication online. So that newsletter is being communicated more frequently. But one of the things was that I had even realized that the next publication of the date when it was scheduled to go out was too far out for the way that I was feeling in regard to what I was reading about what the impacts that was happening in the API community. You know, I just tried to take you along the trajectory. I mean, we've all lived the COVID-19 thing over the last 2 months. And when it became really crystal clear through the Advancing Asian Americans Justice Organization, how bad the incidents were, I couldn't even wait for my newsletter. And so I just wrote a letter. And I wrote a letter and I sent it to everyone that I had access to. And what that did was that I took the letter and then I came up with the first version. We came up with the first version of the presentation that you just saw. Just put together 5 slides and I showed it with colleagues, and I took it to, in that case, it was the Provost Council, which is like the Dean's Council at my institution. And I just said, hey, I'm not sure if everyone's paying attention to it, but this is what's going on. And I just need all of us to pay attention to it in your areas, in the colleges and the programs that you're leading. Please send my slides out to your own newsletters. Here's an example of a letter I wrote. Take my letter and make it your own and put your name on it, but send something out to your school or college or department so that people know that you're thinking about it. And the reason, and then it continued from there into here I am now presenting this webinar that I've had more time to develop out even further from that very first, letter and presentation that I've done. That's how it happens. In a class period, you hear something and you bring up a current issue and you find a way to integrate it into the curriculum of the day. That's how diversity, equity, and inclusion work is going to continue. And that's how it's actually made relevant to students and to faculty and to staff, is being able to talk about real testimonies. And you notice I grounded this presentation in testimonies. All of the diversity and equity work is contextualized in history and experience, but it's the current day experiences is what makes it relevant and real. And so if we as educators can understand that fundamentally, we don't have to look too far. If we are paying attention to anything that's happening in our environments, we're going to see equity and inclusion opportunities. And it doesn't have to be in a sociology only class. It should happen in our mathematics curriculum. It can happen in our science curriculum. I mean, look at the what's happening with the health outcomes of those that are being impacted and dying from COVID-19. If there's not a racism, institutionalized racism about those that are being impacted the most, those that don't have access to things, if you don't think that that is an issue of immigration justice with undocumented communities, or those that are homeless and the way that they're being impacted, the number of African Americans alone that are dying in New York City and Washington, D.C., and all throughout the country, the disproportionate, if you don't think that's connected to the economic and social inequalities that lead to different type of health conditions, higher incidence of diabetes and heart disease and other underlying issues that makes African Americans more susceptible to not only illness, but actual death with this COVID-19 situation. All of those things are intersecting to one another. And going back to Father Massengill's presentation to us, he had said that the bridge of racism will lead to all these other issues. And so we can integrate all of this. I mean, the environment and the world is rich with equity education right now. You'd actually have to be under a rock to not notice the demands of equity that is in everything, in our environmental justice discussions, in our disability justice discussions, in our immigration justice discussions, in our gender justice discussions. It's everywhere. It's just a matter of us both having the heart and to be able to find a way to integrate it into our curriculum in new and in exciting ways, and integrate it in a department meeting, just like I did with my meeting. It was online. I had my colleagues in boxes, and here I am giving my little presentation. But I got little chats like, Mary, this is really good. I'm going to use this in this way. And then one of the deans said, Mary, I'm having an all faculty meeting on Friday. Can you give this to all my faculty? And then sure enough, it was 187 faculty members. He just turned it over to me. And so we can take this, and my urging to you as a colleague in this work that is doing mission work through the demands of equity is to think about how you can do this yourself, and to take this presentation, to go through and to mimic it in a way that makes sense for your school. I saw my some of my friends from Jesuit High School in Los Angeles on this call. So I see there's some secondary schools that are here, and I'm on the board of St. Ignatian's College Prep here in San Francisco, the Jesuit High School. So how can these things be integrated in the high school curriculums as well as in the university?
Thanks, Mary. That was a great perspective there. Another question, I think it's from someone in higher ed. I'm pretty sure based on the question. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but basically they said, as students were trickling away from our campus after the crisis began, so it sounds like maybe it happened a little bit incrementally, it was people of color, predominantly contract workers, housekeepers, cafeteria, dining hall employees, grounds crew and folks like that, that were sustaining the work of the campus, that were the ones that were at greatest risk in terms of contact and social distancing and things like that. How do we stand with those, often who have marginal voices in our campus communities, especially contract employees, in the midst of this crisis when we're not there with them on campus?
Thank you for that question. That has been an issue that has come up nationally as well as regionally. And you're seeing some reports. I saw something recently in the New York Times this week where they were talking about the individuals who are providing janitorial services to those that are first responders, even in the hospital and the medical centers, that oftentimes may not have the protective gear that they need in order to basically clean the spaces that the medical professionals need to have cleaned. And so as well as bus drivers and municipalities that are keeping transportation flowing, and subway drivers, and all those that do not have a option to dial in like I have the privilege to do, and be able to do my work from the confines of my home, but from the benefit and the comfort of my home, of not having to expose myself. And so those are very real inequities, very real challenges in the ways in which society has set up ourselves, in which some people are able to shelter in place, and where others are not able to do that, and they're leaving their children at home and trying to figure out how their children are going to be educated. And so how do you stand in solidarity with those that are being oppressed and have disproportionate impacts on your own campus? The first thing you do is by articulating it and saying it out loud, and recognizing it. One of the ways in which you perhaps may want to check and see on your campus is what are the things that your campus is doing to ensure that they are safely following all the CDC protocols? I believe most of our campuses are very responsive to those things. And one of the things I think that we can also do is to, if we have access to them, I know the contract workers, we don't have their email addresses like we do some individuals, but we have members on our campus that we do have their contact information who are showing up every day. Our public safety workers, some other health workers are on our campuses, as well as our ITS workers who have been rock stars. And to keep so much of this, our work going, to send a thank you note to them, to connect with them, to let them know how much you appreciate them for teaching all of us how to use Zoom, to getting us all online so quickly. They were working day and night to try to get staff and faculty up to par so that we can continue our work, you know, so thanking anybody that's in your ITS areas for the work that they do. But so much of this work is, I think, that we're learning how we can be allies to those that are being impacted. But the first thing that I think is to recognize the privilege that you have.
Sure. Stepping away from just this crisis, just the immediacy of the crisis, someone asked, how do we position ourselves to have diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals who are part of senior leadership of institutions to have a significant amount of input into decision-making happening at the institution? I think that's actually bringing the crisis back into it. I think that's even more important right now, that this area is very much a core part of the decision-making of the institution, because there are some significant decisions that institutions are going to need to make in the next few months.
So as a question, how do we bring it into?
Yeah, so how do we, so for example, you're a vice provost at the University of San Francisco, involved with senior leadership there at the university. How do those who are maybe not in senior leadership or bring these issues to the forefront of institutions?
I think to take it to whomever you are able to connect with, that, but there's always infrastructure in the campuses. There's always groups on all the campuses, whether or not you have somebody that has a title like mine or not, that the work has always existed even before people like me have roles. And so to take it to those faculty, staff, and even students that have been leading in this area for years, they already know what the issues are. And if you're not already connected to any of those groups, to make sure that you are connected to them, because there's always ways in which you can just bring information up to, if it's to deans, in some cases, to directors, to vice presidents, to people on your campus, if there's any issues where you're located, so that they become aware of it. But that's always been, that question has come up on a multitude of times at conferences where people say, we don't have someone that's a vice president or a vice provost like you, so what do I do? I always say that there's already groups of individuals, faculty, staff, and students that are engaged in equity and inclusion work, and make sure that you get yourself connected to them because they become primary resources to help to advance any issues and bubble up any issues. And individuals like myself, that's what I do. Because we were all isolated in shelter in place, I was able to just really spend a lot of time going through the news outlets. And because I'm part of diversity kind of listservs, I was seeing the bubbling up that was happening within the API community. But it was connecting with individuals in the API community is when I really was able to understand to what degree that this is happening. And so always connect to individuals who are impacted by those, whatever the issue is, because not only do you actually get accurate information through their narratives and their lived experiences, you also probably will find out how things work on your campus community, and how you can bring issues forward.
Thanks, Mary. Switching gears again, someone wanted to ask about immigrant students and immigrant members of campus communities. In particular, in the midst of the crisis, of course, we just had President Trump's announcement earlier this week about kind of, closing off immigration for green card holders. Not the portion of people that impacts is maybe pretty narrow, but there's the potential impact of the tenor of the action, right? And the way it gets people thinking about immigrant persons. In addition, Secretary DeVos, the Secretary of Education, announced that federal COVID-19 response funding for higher education could not apply to DACA recipient students. And we also see that there are some, guidelines around some of the COVID support that can't be utilized by immigrant persons or folks with undocumented members of their family unit. So lots of examples of ways that kind of immigrants are being placed in a different, aside in a way. How do schools, whether it's a high school or a college, continue to support immigrant students and including DACA recipients in the midst of all this? Or what are you doing at USF?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I tried to do in my presentation is that I wanted to model for you promising practices. These are promising equity practices. So this wasn't me just giving information. I am also educating on how you can do this yourself. You notice that I had a slide and I had a series of slides that was around advocacy and collecting data. One of the things that you can do is that make sure that you understand who's doing advocacy where you're located, both on the school itself, in the community that you're in the region that you're in. Understand who's doing advocacy for undocumented students or communities or documented communities where you're located. So that's the first thing, to gather that information and make sure you know who those contacts are and you have those resources. Just recently, if you missed it, Chris led a kind of a teach-in or an update, an ISN update about the upcoming and expected decision that we're expecting around the Supreme Court around undocumented students, and particularly with documented students and around DACA. And in it, ISN, we've put together, and his team put together, a really brilliant toolkit that is a resource for campuses on how to respond, kind of what I did, because in some ways you can think of this a little bit like a toolkit, but maybe to some degree, of possible letters and things to do in the event of. Gather all of those types of things, because in those resources, those advocacy resources, such as the ISN and where you're located, you're going to find the organizations and the people who are at the forefront, that have gathered all the information that you may need that will help you to advise and bring up issues on your own campus. Basically, nothing needs to be reinvented because there's always organizations, thank goodness right now, that are paying close attention, that are deeply committed to the issues that impact undocumented students. And then unfortunately, none of us know exactly what's going to happen with the Supreme Court ruling, but we all have to be prepared for it. And that's much of the work individuals like myself is thinking about: what are the steps that we have to have in place or need to take as a campus community in the event that the outcome continues along the patterns of both the racist ideology and a kind of a racist narrative that we have seen. And one of the things that being a student of racism, particularly in the US, the reason why that's so important in my diversity, equity, and inclusion work is that I'm never really surprised by anything that happens in this country. If anything, my job is to understand what the patterns are. My job is to understand the ways in which its pernicious nature shows up in organizations, both unconsciously and consciously, and to think about ways in which we then use all that we have, i.e. our mission, to respond in hopeful and aspirational ways that can help mitigate and hopefully make things better. And so, so much of this, you know, I guess none of us would have, some people say they would have never expected the election of 2016. Actually, there's a lot of people that could have expected that, that to happen based upon the progress that had been happening among communities of color and among so much of the work that we have been doing. And if you know anything about how backlashes work, it's always within a context of perceived and or real scarcity, and the anxiety and the fears that produces. And so if you look at in any society where there had been scapegoating and there had been backlash, such as racism, such as the racism that we're seeing with our Latinx communities, particularly, but all documented people from all around the world that are experiencing these issues, particularly communities of color that are undocumented, because not all undocumented communities are experiencing it the same way. So the way that communities of color that are undocumented are experiencing this, it follows a long pattern of history that could be actually predicted in these times of progress, and to have a backlash in the way that we've seen it based upon perceived loss and anxiety, and as well as fear.
Sure. One more question, Mary, is that all right? Yes. Someone asked about the mental and emotional health of students, in particular students of color, in the midst of this crisis, you know, in light of so many of the things that we've talked about here that are impacting different groups of people, and how to best support students, particularly in this kind of, you know, virtual digital reality of not being able to sit, you know, across from someone and talk to them face to face, at least not in person. How do you offer support? And I think this question has application both at the secondary and higher ed level.
As I mentioned before, you know, I'm located at USF, which is a university, and we have made all of our support services available, particularly our counseling and psychological services. Students are able to have sessions with clinicians, and I think that is really important, you know, that if your school has been able to create both whether it's academic coaching and advising, and the ways in which it has gone remote, we have to connect in a remote learning environment, and actually we can connect with one another and support one another in remote learning environments. But I'll say something again that I said earlier, is that the most important thing we can do is to send signals to people by whether it's communicating that you saw this webinar, whether integrating something in your curriculum, whether it's in a check-in, find a way to perhaps approach the subject matter without putting anybody on the spot. So to think thoughtfully about how you might approach someone if you just want to see how they're doing. And usually the best thing you can do is ask them how they're doing, particularly if they are Asian identified. That's the most important thing we can do, is to signal to people through what we have available to us. We have our ability to teach, we have our ability to advise, we have our ability to counsel, we have our ability to write, all the things we do as educators, to use those tools and as assets to create what I call a culture of care. And that's the work that we have to do with all of our students right now, and students that are being disproportionately impacted because of the ongoing racism that I want all of us to now be aware of, that this is not momentarily. We should expect this to continue. So this ongoing racism that will be happening targeting the Asian American community and the API community. Let's be clear about that. It's targeting Chinese Americans or anybody that they perceive to be Chinese American. And then the ways in which it's in the backdrop of the other racism that we talked about, that we all have both a duty and an obligation in our Ignatian tradition to use all of the platforms that we have, regardless of our titles. And even if you think that your position is not important enough, all our positions are important enough, to find a way to communicate and create a culture of care in this remote learning environment that can continue for some months ahead.
Sure. Yes. And I think we need to be prepared for that reality as well. So, well, Mary, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful to be with you, and grateful for both the work you're doing at University of San Francisco, but the ways you're able to support other networks, including this Ignatian network, this Ignatian family. And thanks to those who joined us from across the country as well. We will be sharing both the recording of this, as well as some of the additional resources that were mentioned, and Mary's slides, so you have access to those hyperlinks that are within the presentation. So thank you for being with us today, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all.